Welcome to this explainer. You know, genealogical records are usually pretty dry, aren't they? I mean, sure, they give us the dates, the places, maybe a census line with an occupation, but they rarely give us the actual heartbeat of the people who lived those lives. But what if we could take those raw facts and actually breathe life into them? Well, today we're going to dive into this deeply moving piece of historical fiction. It takes the documented life of a real man, Charles Auble, and transforms it into this incredibly intimate, imagined 1916 conversation between a dying father and his teenage daughter. So let's jump right in and uncover the legacy of a seemingly ordinary life that actually holds some pretty extraordinary lessons for all of us.
Picture this. It's early 1916, in a quiet room in San Diego. Charles Auble is frail. He's recently suffered a severe fall, his side is aching, and he knows deep down that his time is drawing really short. So he's preparing to pass his entire life story on to his daughter, Emily, who's almost 17. By framing the real, documented facts of his life through this imagined, highly personal conversation, the author just instantly cranks up the emotional stakes. It immediately makes you wonder, right? If you had one last chance to explain your entire life's journey to your child, what are the absolutely most important things you would say?
All right, let's start with part one, A Father's 1916 Memoir, focusing on his origins in Newark, New Jersey. To really understand the man at the end of his life, we have to rewind to the very beginning. We need to unpack the early years that shaped his entire worldview, long before the American landscape started changing at warp speed around him. Charles was born right on Halloween, October 31st, 1849, in Newark, New Jersey. He was born into this bustling household of 6 kids: William, Fanny, Kate, Anna, Cora, and himself. His childhood was totally anchored by honest, hands-on labor. His father, David, ran a shoemaking shop, while his mother, Sarah, managed their chaotic, busy home. Imagine him growing up walking those mid-19th century city streets, constantly surrounded by that rich, earthy smell of leather from his dad's work. That kind of environment, the tangible, manual labor, the deep family roots, it left a massive imprint on him. It built a lifelong respect for working with your hands that would basically define the rest of his days. Moving right along to part two, his journey across a growing America, specifically his westward migration and finding his trade. As Charles grew up, the whole country was literally growing right alongside him. And his life, it was a restless one. He was constantly in motion. He starts out in Newark in 1849, but then in 1864, when he's just 15 years old and right in the thick of the Civil War, his dad decides to pack up the family and move west to Terre Haute, Indiana. I mean, that meant leaving absolutely everything he knew behind. Decades later, as he's approaching 40, he strikes out on his own to the booming, chaotic metropolis of Chicago. And finally, around 1911, looking for a change of scenery in his later years, he heads all the way to San Diego, California. His physical journey perfectly mirrored the westward expansion and all the growing pains of 19th century America. It really goes to show that sometimes you just have to leave the familiar to find exactly where you're meant to be. It was actually after that first huge move to Terre Haute that he found his true calling. Charles is super clear with his daughter about this. He wasn't a fine artist, not at all. Instead, he became a house painter and decorator, and he took an immense amount of pride in this highly practical trade. For him, it was all about knowing exactly how to mix colors, how to lay a perfectly clean line, and taking a boring plain wall and transforming it into something a family could genuinely be proud of. By the time the 1870 census rolled around, he was probably listing his occupation as a painter. Interestingly, he actually stayed living with his parents in Terre Haute well into his 30s. It's a great little reminder that back then, young men weren't always in such a huge rush to strike out totally on their own. Which brings us to part 3, building a family in Chicago. We'll look at brotherhood, romance, and his rather late start to family life. Eventually, though, a guy gets restless. Watching his sisters stay close to home, Charles decided he wanted more. So when he finally navigates the massive, intimidating streets of Chicago, he finds 2 incredibly crucial things. First up, he joined the Painters Union. For a guy alone in a giant city, this offered a built-in, lifelong brotherhood, guys who looked out for each other and made sure their families were okay. But the absolute biggest milestone, meeting Georgina Kemp, or Georgia. She'd come down from Ontario, Canada. She was bright, super quick, and totally unimpressed by this old bachelor's clumsy attempts at charm. Charles actually admits to Emily that he courted her with whatever cheap flowers he could afford and what he himself calls terrible poems. But hey, his persistence totally paid off. They were married in Milwaukee on June 19, 1898. He tells Emily straight up that marrying her mother was hands down the best decision he ever made. Check out this incredible contrast in his life's chapters. For decades, Charles was just this restless bachelor. He was drifting between random addresses on Madison and Monroe Streets in Chicago, an aging tradesman trying to navigate the world totally on his own. He was honestly pretty self-conscious about getting older, even hiding his real age. But then, a complete 180. He becomes the settled family man. He gets married at age 50, and less than 14 months later, in August 1899, he welcomes his one and only child, Emily. Holding her in those first few days just shifted his entire universe. He discovered this profound truth. A man can spend 50 years working with his bare hands to paint 100 houses, but absolutely nothing he builds matters even half as much as the family he makes. All right, diving into the final section here. Final lessons in San Diego, where he faces his faults and looks at the legacy he's leaving behind. Let's fast forward a bit. When Emily was about 12, roughly 1911, the family moved out to San Diego to be closer to George's brothers and just get a fresh change of scenery. Charles set up his painting studio right in the basement of their house on 14th Street. And now, as he sits in that chair in 1916, getting ready to give his daughter his final thoughts, what makes this historical narrative so incredibly captivating is his complete willingness to confess his flaws. He doesn't try to paint himself as some flawless hero. He flat out admits he enjoyed his drink way more than he should have, often stressing out his wife and ruining his own health. He confesses to being terribly vain about his age, lying to Georgia when he really should have just trusted her to love him as he was. And he warns Emily about pride, how it makes you do foolish things just to protect an image that, at the end of the day, really doesn't matter. It's this exact vulnerability that makes his final advice so deeply authentic. So distilling a whole lifetime of migrating across the country, doing hard manual labor, and finding love late in life, Charles leaves Emily, and honestly all of us, with 3 really actionable steps for living a good life. Step 1, work hard at whatever trade or calling you find and adapt as the world changes. Step 2, love the people in your life without holding back, even with all your personal faults. And step 3, don't be afraid to leave the familiar for a new chapter. He reminds her that leaving Newark, Terre Haute, and Chicago always felt like he was losing something, but it always led him exactly to where he needed to be. Ultimately, we're left with this incredibly poignant realization. After a really full life, Charles tells Emily to take care of her mother, reminding her that the two of them together can face absolutely anything. Despite a half-century of expertly painting and decorating homes, a person's truest, most enduring legacy is simply the love they leave behind. Charles Auble passed away on March 23, 1916, shortly after that nasty fall. And while this specific conversation might be imagined by the author, the historical truths of his life validate the sentiment completely. It leaves us with a pretty powerful question to ponder today. When you finally look back at the sum of your own life, what will be the finest work you leave behind?